a great leader in Europe, Viktor Orban. He's the prime minister of Hungary. He's a very great leader, very strong man. Some people don't like him because he's too strong. It's nice to have a strong man running your country. Viktor Orban. Did anyone ever hear of him? He's probably like one of the strongest leaders anywhere in the world. And he's the leader of, right? He's the leader of Turkey, Viktor Orban. And he's the head of Hungary, and he runs it tough. Let me tell you, he runs it properly. He runs it strong.
You got it right twice there. Of course, it's Hungary, not Turkey, folks. Hi again. It's 5 o'clock in New York. That was, of course, the disgraced, twice impeached ex-president Donald Trump, who has made no secret of his affinity for, and dare we say, obsession with the world's autocrats and dictators, a dangerous club of what he says admiringly are strongmen, leaders who are so strong. Trump is desperate to elbow his way into that group. It's a clique that includes Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, to name a few. And now one of the members of the Dictators Club is right here on American soil for an epic hangout with America's wannabe dictator. The autocrat in question is Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. He has been called, quote, the ultimate 21st century dictator, a title he earned by, quote, chipping away at his country's democratic systems through policies that are hostile to LGBTQ people and immigrants and crackdowns on the free press and the judiciary. Is that ringing any bells? Today, on this day, the State of the Union, Viktor Orban is in Washington, D.C., meeting with the head of the Heritage Foundation, the ultra-conservative activist think tank and mastermind of Project 2025 that plans to, quote, in their own words, dismantle the U.S. government and replace it with Trump's vision. Tomorrow, Orban is heading south to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump and discuss how to end the war in Ukraine. And given that Orban is the guy who's been cozying up to Putin and holding up European aid to Ukraine, that conversation should be interesting. Now Trump rolling out the red carpet for Viktor Orban might not sound like such a huge deal, but it has massive implications. Or as the New Republic puts it, quote, Trump's Mar-a-Lago meeting with Viktor Orban should terrify us all. As Americans, we may not be overly familiar with who Viktor Orban is and his own personal journey into autocracy. But if you know one thing, know this. Orban's calling card is chaos and cruelty. Again, ringing some familiar notes, right? Importantly, experts who study strongmen and study how democracies backslide into autocracy say Orban's brand of dictatorship could be easier to replicate for wannabe dictators like Donald Trump. Easier to imitate than, say, murdering your enemies in broad daylight like Vladimir Putin or the militant authoritarianism of Kim Jong-un. As Amanda Carpenter at Protect Democracy warns, quote, Orban is a model for retaking the executive office and then consolidating power for maximum authoritarian impact. Like Trump, Orban was ousted by voters and then spent time out of office making plans to win the next election, seize control of the levers of power, and abolish democratic checks in the system, ensuring he would never lose again. Moreover, Orban is the textbook example of why autocrats are often much more dangerous the second term in office. They learn from their mistakes, their shortcomings, and above all, the things that caused them to lose power previously. Orban is well on his way to staying in office for the rest of his life. On that, too, Trump aims to do the same. And that is exactly what we are seeking to examine with our series, American Autocracy, It Can Happen Here. And that is where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Staff writer for The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum, is with us. She is the author of Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Plus, writer and editor for Protect Democracy, the aforementioned Amanda Carpenter's here. Her newsletter, If You Can Keep It, is a must-read. And Rachel Kleinfeld's here, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And what are your thoughts? I mean, at one level, of course, Orban's heading to Mar-a-Lago. He might even use a bathroom where classified state secrets were stashed until Trump was indicted. But there is a lot that Trump is saying out loud and from the podium that has more than an echo in Viktor Orban's journey.
So what's important about Orban is that he was democratically elected. Hungary was a democracy. It's still a member of NATO. It's still a member of the European Union. Orban had popular support. He won a big election victory, actually. But what matters is what he did after he won. And he then began to systematically, piece by piece, dismantle the institutions of democracy. And he did so in his case, he did so at first without breaking the law. He changed the Constitution because he had a constitutional majority. He altered the judges. He began doing some things behind the scenes. So, for example, he played around with the press. People who advertised in the opposition press suddenly had trouble getting government contracts. And because Hungary is a small country, he also began to dominate the economy, making sure that his businessmen, his oligarchs, stayed ahead. And by doing so over a number of years, he made himself impossible to remove from power. And that is now the model of democratic takeover. When you want to destroy a democracy nowadays, you don't have a coup d'etat. You don't need to send the tanks into the presidential palace and shoot up the ceiling. What you do is you take it apart piece by piece, and others have copied him. The previous Polish government attempted to copy him. They didn't quite succeed, and they lost an election in October. The Israeli government has tried to copy him, and that was actually the big story in Israel last summer before the Gaza war began. It's not that different from what Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela. This isn't necessarily a right-wing process. It can also be a left-wing process. But watch what he has, not what he says. I mean, what he says about LGBT rights or about migration is horrific, but it's not so much that. Those are the games that he plays to keep your eye away from the ball. And what matters is what he does to the judges, what he does to the civil service, what he does to the media.
And Anne, the thing that made him popular, if I remember accurately, was the issue of immigration, right? He made sure that Hungary was less porous and welcoming at a time when other European countries were having massive flows of migrants. Is that right?
It was actually even a bit more dramatic than that, because Hungary doesn't have a migration problem. I mean, the United States, you can say there is a migration issue. Hungary doesn't have one. Nobody is moving to Hungary. It doesn't have lots of migrants, and it's not an issue. What he did was create the impression of an issue. He created hysteria around it. He linked himself to far-right ideas about replacement theory, that there was a Jewish cabal led by George Soros that wants to replace white Hungarians with brown people or foreigners or whatever version of it that you prefer. And he created this anxiety. And as I said, that was in a way, that's the veil, this kind of fake culture war that he creates to distract people and to anger people and to play into people's emotions and people's fears about, whatever they're afraid of, about loss of national identity, about globalization, about the economy, whatever it is. He made people focus on that. And while they were paying attention to that, he was in fact changing Hungary's political system.
Rachel, you write about one of the institutions where you don't have to see behind the curtain in Mar-a-Lago to know that Trump covets this. You write this: elected leaders who use their popularity to ride roughshod over their country's institutions. In Orban's case, that meant putting all of Hungary's courts under the control of one of his loyalists. Trump, I think, thinks he's made some progress on that progress with his appointees to the Supreme Court. I think they would beg to differ. But that is very much an active project on Trump's part. He's gone after the rule of law since his first day as president.
That's right. One of the things that Orban did, as Anne said, was centralize power. And he centralized power first through the courts, taking over, changing their independence. As you said, Trump has already made some serious headway in this area in America. Orban also centralized power over regular people, firemen, nurses, local nonprofits, soccer leagues that were previously completely apolitical. But he made everything into politics. I think one of the parts of the Orban story that gets told the least is how he took over the business sector. The business sector in Hungary had been a normal capitalist sector right before he took power. And after just 8 years, he had basically moved into so many fields with him and his cronies forcing companies to be either paying high taxes or high levels of regulation or give up their companies, villainizing companies until they gave up, driving people out of town, that he had basically turned what had been a independent sector into something that was really decided, who won and who lost in the business arena was really much more decided by the Fidesz party. And that's another area that Trump really wants to move into, because these autocrats are not just in it for power, they're also in it for money. And there's a huge amount of corruption that lies behind these power grabs. And Orban has shown the way, and I would very much expect that we would see some of that in America.
You know,